start the recording now. So hello, everyone. My name is Sean Han again. And on behalf of the Chosŏn History Society, I want to thank everyone for joining in today's Zoom event. Whether you're joining from morning time, afternoon, evening, or midnight, we thank you for your time and effort. And I also want to thank Dr. Jung for giving us this wonderful opportunity to hear about her research on transnational history of early modern Korea and Japan. So before I introduce today's speaker, let me first introduce about our organization, the Chosŏn History Society, the mission of our organization, and what we do. So the Chosŏn History Society is a public learned society promoting the study, research, and teaching of Korea's past. With that mission, our goal is to foster an active community of researchers and content creators of Korea's past. We connect scholars and those content creators, both outside and inside of professional academia across disciplines. Our main goal is to provide opportunities for scholars and content creators who are operating independently or otherwise under-resourced to share their fascinating work to both public and the academic. So we have currently two projects ongoing. First one is the translation and consultation project, and the second one is the public Zoom talk series that we are attending here. So we encourage you all to visit our website, chosonhistorysociety.org. And one last thing, many of you ask about our name, Chosŏn History Society, whether what we do here is only confined to the Chosŏn Dynasty period. And that is not correct. We have a very broad definition of what Chosŏn can mean, starting from old Chosŏn, 고조선, all the way to Chosŏn Dynasty, 식민지 조선, colonial Chosŏn, and Chosŏn 인민민주주의 공화국. So yeah, we define Chosŏn as a signifier that can connect scholars across disciplines who works on various topics about Korea's past. So this includes obviously ancient medieval history, colonial history, and authoritarian and post-authoritarian period as well. So without further ado, I will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jung. Dr. Jung is the Shirley Z Johnson Assistant Curator of Japanese Arts at the Smithsonian's Institution of National Museum of Asian Art, where she oversees the museum's collection of premodern to contemporary Japanese ceramics, lacquerware, metalwork, and tea-related objects. Currently, Dr. Jung is working on various curation project exhibitions at the Smithsonian Institute of National Museum of Asian Art, including striking objects, contemporary Japanese metalwork, and another one is knotted clay, raku ceramics, and tea, also at the National Museum of Asian Art, and chado, Japanese way of tea ceremony demonstration. And she is also working with the Japan Past and Present, which is also a digital project under the title of Teaching Tea, Culture, History, Practice, Art Resource about Korean Tea Bowl, which will be held in UCLA, also a conference that will be held in UCLA at the end of this month, April. So Dr. Jung specialized in Japanese art history with a focus on how transnational maritime trade impact Japan's visual culture during the pre-modern period. Dr. Jung received her BA with distinction in History of Arts at the University of Pennsylvania, and her MA and PhD in Art and Archaeology from Princeton University. Dr. Jung curated Princeton University Art Museum's first thematic exhibition of Korean ceramics entitled Korean Ceramics, From Archaeology to Art History. She has examined the reception of Korean tea bowls called kōrai chawan in Japan during the 16th century. Jung conducted fieldwork at various Japanese maritime settlement sites and analyzed tea documents, literary texts, and archaeological remains from Korea and Japan. Her research has been supported by the Metropolitan Center for Far Eastern Art Studies and the Kyujanggak International Center for Korean Studies. Jung is the author of a peer-reviewed article titled Mapping the Circulation and Use of Korean Tea Bowls in 16th Century Japan, which is published by Korean Studies Journal, not the Journal of Korean Studies, in 2023, last year, as part of special section Digital Korean Studies. So her article is amazing. It really expands our understanding of transnational impact of premodern Korean ceramics by facilitating unfamiliar primary source through digital humanity tools. So we look forward to learn more about her study on ceramic bowls, digital humanities project, and after the talk, we wish to have a chance to hear more about and ask questions related to her digital visualization tools and methods. So now, please welcome Dr. Jung. So Dr. Jung, when you're ready, you may unmute yourself and begin the talk.
Thank you, Sean, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to the Chosŏn History Society for giving me this opportunity today to share some of my work in progress with you. And I'll also, as Dr. Han mentioned briefly the research project that this current research stemmed from. My article that was published in Korean Studies Journal special section on digital Korean studies. And let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay, so I hope that everyone can see my screen here. So my talk is titled Order-Made Korean Tea Bowls and the Transcultural Impact of Chosŏn Dynasty Art in 17th Century Japan. And I'm going to begin with this tea bowl that you see here, which is in our collection. So this is in the collection of the National Museum of Asian Art. Just to clarify, we're part of the Smithsonian Institution, and we're comprised of two galleries. So the Freer Gallery of Art, which was founded in 1923 with the bequest of Charles Lang Freer. So it actually became the first national museum of art on the National Mall, featuring art from America, primarily paintings by J. McNeill Whistler, but most importantly, Asian art that Charles Lang Freer collected. So this museum was revolutionary for its time in the sense that Freer wanted to show that Asian art was as important and as valuable as Western painting, as Western art. So the core of the collection is really Freer's collection of Asian art spanning from Egypt all the way to Japan. And he happened to collect a lot of ceramics, a lot of Japanese ceramics, Korean ceramics, Chinese, Near Eastern ceramics. And this tea bowl is something that Freer collected in 1907. So this tea bowl embodies a long history of cross-cultural trade between Japan and Korea. You can see on the outside of this bowl, there are repeated inlaid designs of medallions, wavy lines, and spirals. And these designs are also seen on the inside as well. The potter first carved these designs into the clay body. Then the potter applied white slip on the surface to fill the cavities created by those incisions, but wiped it off unevenly so that thick, milky patches obscure both the inlaid patterns and the brown body of the vessel. This bowl that you see here is an example of what is called in Japan kōrai chawan, literally Korean tea bowl. Kōrai chawan are ceramic tea bowls that were made in Korea and then brought to Japan, and that in Japan gained appreciation among Japanese tea practitioners beginning in the 16th century. So at first, Korean potters fired these vessels, perhaps for ceremonial use or as tableware, but without any awareness that Japanese collectors, Japanese tea practitioners would use them as tea bowls. These Korean ceramics then entered Japan through most likely unofficial private trade at the time, and Japanese collectors then selected vessels that they deemed suitable for use as tea bowls. So the term kōrai in kōrai chawan is derived from the Korean name Koryo for the dynasty that ruled the Korean peninsula from 918 to 1392. However, the use of this term in Japan referred to a Japanese ideal of Korea, much in the way that the Japanese term kara, derived from the Chinese character for the Tang Dynasty, referred to a Japanese ideal of China. Chawan literally translates to tea bowl. So the term kōrai chawan makes its first appearance in tea-related documents in 1537 in a diary called Matsuya Kaiki, which was kept by a tea practitioner and merchant called Matsuya Hisamasa. And from that time onward, Korean tea bowls grew into an established category of tea utensils of considerable renown in Japan. By the end of the 16th century, in 1588, the tea practitioner Yamano no Soji wrote in his tea manual called Yamano no Sojiki, or the Records of Yamano no Soji, that, quote, Chinese tea bowls are being discarded. Presently, it is kōrai chawan, newly fired tea bowls, and even down to seto tea bowls that are preferred tea bowls. So in just 5 decades, from 1537 to 1588, Korean tea bowls became highly valued objects in Japan, even eclipsing long revered Chinese antiques. So let me go back in time a little bit. So prior to the introduction of kōrai chawan, Japanese tea practitioners used tea bowls from China, which came to Japan from the continent along with the custom of drinking whisked powdered tea. The Ashikaga shoguns, who were early practitioners of tea beginning in the 14th century, primarily utilized Chinese objects at their tea gatherings. The shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa became a key patron of the arts in his retirement as an active collector and tea practitioner. The villa that he built for his retirement is now the Jishoji Zen Temple in Kyoto, more colloquially known as the Silver Pavilion, Ginkakuji. And Yoshimasa had originally planned for the temple to be covered in silver foil in contrast to the golden pavilion built by his grandfather Yoshimitsu, which is why even though the pavilion itself is not silver, the temple is known as the Silver Pavilion. So on the history when it was first built, and inside is a room called Dojinsai, consisting of 4.5 tatami mats and architectural details such as a scholar's desk and a built-in staggered display shelf. And it is said to be the oldest extant Japanese tea room. So it was here that the retired Shogun Yoshimasa displayed his prized Chinese paintings and calligraphy, ceramics such as celadon flower containers, and Chinese jianware tea bowls, commonly placed on lacquered stands like you see here as a way of elevating and beautifying the presentation of these objects. And the use of these jianware tea bowls, called tenmoku in Japan, in reference to Mount Tianmu, where the monks, the Chinese Zen monks, practiced meditation and drank this kind of powdered whisk tea. These jianware tea bowls was a preference adopted from China and appreciated by Japanese collectors who continued the custom of preparing powdered whisk tea in these tea bowls. So the contents of the Shogun's collection, along with a guide on the proper display and arrangement of these Chinese antiques, were codified in the Kundaigan Sochoki, or the Manual of the Shogunal Attendant. This manual was compiled by the shogun's cultural advisors or collection managers called doboshu. Later, 16th century tea practitioners valued these Chinese antiques, which were favored by the Ashikaga shoguns, but they began to incorporate non-Chinese items as well, owing to the growing rarity of the Chinese antiques and a simultaneous shift in aesthetic preferences. So the acclaim for kōrai chawan marked a significant shift in Japanese taste, a move away from Sinocentrism towards an aesthetic syncretism that involved objects from China, Southeast Asia, Korea, and Japan. So kōrai chawan, in this context, have a complex identity as a cultural object. On one hand, these ceramics are products of Korean clay, plant matter, water, minerals, hands, technique, and know-how. But as tea bowls, their cultural lives have unfolded almost exclusively in the realm of Japanese tea practice. And also, a tea bowl within the Japanese context is one of the many so-called tea utensils, or dogu, namely objects necessary for the preparation and enjoyment of tea. Other tea utensils included hanging scrolls of painting or calligraphy, a kettle for boiling the water, water container to store fresh water, flower container for displaying flower arrangements, tea caddy for containing the powdered tea, a tea scoop to scoop it out of the caddy, the whisk to make the tea, water ladle. These are just a few of the tea utensils that are present and necessary for a tea gathering. However, among all the vessels and containers used at a tea gathering, the tea bowl was really the only object that touched the lips, adding an extra layer of bodily engagement and appreciation for the ceramic. 16th century tea practitioners kept diaries where they listed all the tea utensils that were used at a given gathering. But at times, they also included comments on the clay, glaze, and shape. However, equally tangible to the host and the guests would have been the color of the green tea in contrast to the bowl surface, the mouthfeel of the clay body when drinking from it, and the weight, the shape, texture, and temperature of a tea bowl held in one's hand. So given the conventions of a tea gathering, all participants present would have engaged with tea bowls, such as kōrai chawan, with a degree of intimacy that exceeded that of other objects present at the gathering. So you can see in tea diaries that the term kōrai chawan appeared with increasing frequency in 16th century tea diaries, indicating their growing popularity among Japanese collectors. And here I just want to mention briefly the research that led to my current project to look at order-made Korean tea bowls, which I will talk about in a moment. This tea bowl here is called kizaemon. So in Japan, there's this practice of naming utensils, important utensils, as a way to show connoisseurship and aesthetic engagement with these ceramics. It's also a way of marking relationships as well, where a famous tea practitioner will give a name to an object that someone else owns, and that becomes a part of the object's history, a part of the object's aesthetic pedigree. So this one is called kizaemon. This ceramic is significant in that it is the only Korean ceramic that is a designated national treasure in Japan. And it has a lot to do with the cultural currency of kōrai chawan, and also the fact that a lot of research on kōrai chawan, which tends to be limited to the realm of Japanese art history, if not the even smaller realm of Japanese tea studies, is that heirlooms like this example that you see here on the screen really dominates the narrative on how we understand kōrai chawan and its cultural, historical, artistic, and aesthetic significance. And so my research, my dissertation research, decided to take a different route in understanding kōrai chawan and really the inception of kōrai chawan as an imported category of tea utensil in Japan. So I focus my attention on tea diaries and on archaeological evidence. Tea diaries because they really provide a window into period aesthetics and the period eye. How were these collectors appreciating and understanding, but also displaying kōrai jawan, especially at a time when they were shifting away from just using and showing Chinese objects to include Korean, but also most importantly, even Japanese objects. That's something that tends to get overlooked as well. The fact that, yes, there's this Sino-Japanese binary that permeates our understanding of Japan's historical development. But in the case of tea practice, 16th century tea practice, kōrai jawan are the first non-Chinese tea bowls to be used, or the first tea bowl that does not have direct reference to Chinese models or aesthetics. So that break away from just the Sino-centric aesthetic is something that the kōrai jawan's introduction really marks. So I analyzed a lot of tea diaries for my research, and I also referenced archaeological materials because one big issue with these heirloom kōrai jawan is the fact that none of the extant examples can be traced back to the 16th century context of appreciation. Of course, archaeological evidence has shown that the tea bowls that are heirlooms, that are in private collections, in museum collections, were indeed made in the Chosŏn Dynasty and therefore have a connection to 16th century Japan. They could have plausibly been used in the 16th century, but none of the examples that are extant can be connected to, for example, an instance in a tea gathering documented by these tea practitioners in their diaries. So that's a really important issue as well, that issue of provenance. And archaeology is really the only way that we can understand exactly what the landscape was at the time in terms of what was materially available. So my research brought those two elements together in conversation with the heirlooms. And the Korean Studies Journal article that Dr. Han mentioned included these visualizations, and the kind of path to this was thinking about how to reassess the data that I gathered and that I included in my dissertation. My dissertation was very traditional in the sense that it's about a narrative, it's about writing an essay, so there were no visualizations. There was a long appendix with like a table adapted from the Excel spreadsheets that I created, but I really didn't engage with digital humanities tools. So thanks to the invitation of Javier Cha, who I think is on this call, and also Barbara Wall, and thanks to also my participation in the publication workshop that was held at University of Copenhagen in June 2022, I was able to kind of dip my toes into the digital humanities realm to see what I can learn in terms of the tool Palladio, which is hosted through Stanford, but also to see if these visualizations reveal something new about the data that I gathered. And the answer was yes. So I'm happy to talk about this later. But for now, I'm going to move on to the meat of my presentation, which is about the 17th century case studies of order-made kōrai jawan and how it impacted Japan's visual culture. So I just want to kind of note that in terms of the content of my presentation today, I'm focusing on these two case studies. So you may have questions about the Imjin War, for example, which I will address briefly, but not at length in this presentation. And also, I won't really be touching upon 16th century case studies of kōrai jawan being made and brought to Japan. That's something that I'm also willing to answer in the questions, but it's just a disclaimer. So I'm going to move on now to this slide, which I think it's really important to get a sense of the geography in terms of thinking about this trade and transfer from Korea to Japan and then vice versa. So the Japanese demand for kōrai jawan, of course, increased throughout the 16th century, but surprisingly, it continued into the 17th century, despite the disruption caused by the Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion of the Korean Peninsula during the Imjin War from 1592 to 1598. So the invasion caused a massive disruption of trade, diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan, as well as to the production of ceramics in Korea. The warlord, Hideyoshi himself, was a tea practitioner. He actually appears in these tea diaries that were kept by merchants. And he also owned a kōrai chawan himself. So in the tea manual that I mentioned earlier, Yamanoe no Soji, who was a tea practitioner, who was basically advertising his services through this manual. He was trying to spread the word and let wealthy patrons know that he knows a lot about tea and that he can help you. And he says in that manual that the kōrai chawan that he talks about is something that he found for Hideyoshi. So Hideyoshi was someone who appreciated kōrai chawan. And so perhaps due to this personal interest in Korean ceramics, extant letters show that Hideyoshi ordered each of his commanders to identify skilled artisans and dexterous women in Korea so they could be brought back to Japan after the war, revealing that Hideyoshi saw Korea as a cultural resource, a source of cultural capital and knowledge. The Korean potters brought to Japan their invaluable skills and knowledge of multi-chambered kiln technology, which allowed for high firing temperatures and flexible control of oxygen levels, and as well the ability to find local Japanese sources of kaolin, a necessary ingredient for the production of porcelain, which had yet to be made in Japan. So it was really the know-how of Korean potters that allowed for porcelain production in Japan. So in addition to Hideyoshi's personal interests, Japanese elites also must have seen the value of bringing Korean potters to Japan. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so invested in identifying these skilled individuals. Of course, his retainers, these warriors, already valued imported Chinese and Korean ceramics for tea practice. But equally importantly, the domainal lords or daimyo had long been aware of the wealth that successful kilns had generated for the Seto and Mino domains in present-day Aichi and Gifu prefecture, respectively. And so the potential economic boon that ceramic kilns might offer to their domain was something that would have been on the minds of these daimyo. So Hideyoshi's men took Korean potters back to Japan rather than ceramics and established kilns as a source of such wealth and also cultural capital. So with the displacement of Korean potters, the southern island of Kyushu became a new center for ceramic production. As the newly established kilns in Kyushu as production centers for kōrai chawan copies, archaeological evidence indicates otherwise. Overall, excavation data reveals that in the early stages, Korean potters primarily made tableware for local communities in Kyushu. The Japanese kilns run by Korean potters were not, in other words, open to compete with or replace tea bowls made in Korea, but rather to produce wholly new kinds of ceramics and serve the primary purpose of generating revenue and gifts to present under the newly established Tokugawa shogunate's culture of warrior sociability during the Edo period. Moreover, military elites seem to have had a tacit understanding that the value of kōrai chawan was tied to the fact that they were imported from Korea, leading to a Japanese demand for bowls made to order from Korea. So the production of order-made kōrai chawan in the 17th century was possible due to the establishment of a kiln in Busan, overseen by the So clan of a group of islands called Tsushima. It's right in between Fukuoka and Busan, as you can see on this map. So although the So clan had helped Hideyoshi in his invasion of Korea, by 1609, they managed to negotiate the Kyiu Treaty, a significant first step in reestablishing trade relations between the Chosŏn court and Tsushima. They were granted permission to build the wakan in Japanese, or wegwan in Korean, which translates to Japan House. And this became a base of operations for them. And eventually, with the permission of the Chosŏn court, the So clan established a kiln in Busan with Korean potters. So thus began the production of order-made kōrai chawan, which combined Korean ceramic techniques and styles with Japanese design specifications. So these hybrid ceramics are unique aesthetic products that reflect the collaborative process of their manufacture and trade. While records show that tea practitioners and collectors continue to appreciate older kōrai chawan from the 16th century, order-made tea bowls open possibilities for new designs. And as a result, the kōrai chawan corpus, this category of kōrai chawan, expanded in Japan to include more than a dozen different subcategories. So just for reference, in the 16th century, when you look at records, there's really only four big categories that persist into the present. So if you can imagine just the boom that this order-made industry caused to expand that to more than a dozen, which exists to this day, it really shows the kind of creative potential behind this collaborative cross-cultural endeavor. So by 1694, Japanese tea documents described how these order-made kōrai chawan were created to suit Japanese tastes. They're called gohon chawan, and records of the orders placed from Japan exist among the So clan's documents, which include details, notes, as well as illustrations of desired objects, as you saw in the previous slide. So the increased variety of glaze colors, ornamental motifs, and shapes among these new bowls demonstrate how these ceramics bridge the two cultural contexts of Japan and Korea. And the slip inlay decoration of this order-made kōrai chawan here really evokes the appearance of Korean ceramics known today as puncheong, which were fired initially for the Chosŏn court. So this is an example of a puncheong tea bowl in our collection. You can tell that this is something that was used in Japan as a tea bowl because you might notice an interesting detail here on the rim. This is a lacquer repair that was made in Japan. And this one is particularly lavish. Usually you just apply a lacquer paste mixed with flour, and then you cover the surface with gold. But the person who repaired this took it a step further and actually created a beautiful design on the surface of the repair, which is quite large, using this Japanese technique called makie, or sprinkle picture. So it's the combination of lacquer with gold pigments to create flat but also raised designs. And in this case, the designs are raised. So it shows just the amount of care and attention that was given to this tea bowl. So it must have been very highly valued in Japan for the owner to commission such an expensive and extensive repair. So vessels like this one bear inlaid inscriptions that denote the Chosŏn court office for which it was made. So this example was originally made for the Sanbuin Cebu, or the Crown Prince's office, and it features repeating concentric registers of stamp designs. And the use of stamps expedited the production process in terms of creating surface ornamentation, but it also resulted in this distinctive appearance with densely packed repetitive patterns of dots, floral chrysanthemum medallions, and also lines. So tea diaries show that Japanese tea practitioners called these puncheong-ware vessels mishima beginning in the 16th century. And there was another term, koyomi, and mishima and koyomi were used interchangeably. And the name is said to be a reference to the Mishima Shrine in Ise, which is known for its calendars, koyomi, that feature a tight arrangement of vertical rectangular compartments with inscriptions. So it's clear that Japanese collectors likened the densely packed designs on these Korean puncheong-ware bowls to the Mishima calendars. And in some 16th century diaries, that's why you see that interchangeable use of mishima and koyomi. And although the production of puncheong-ware ceased in 1580, mishima-type kōrai chawan were so popular that Japanese collectors commissioned new bowls in this style when formal trade relations between Korea and Japan were established in the 17th century. And this was really an example of that. So whereas the inlaid designs on the bowl at the frier are abstracted and loose compared to earlier puncheong ceramics, indicating its later 17th century production, other details of the bowl indicate that it was made for Japanese collectors. So after the bowl was thrown on the wheel, the potter notched the foot, you can see the notch detail here, by cutting out a small portion of it, a feature that Japanese tea practitioners appreciated and found desirable for their kōrai chawan. And also you can see from this bird's eye view that this bowl to the left, the order-made kōrai chawan, has a distorted three-lobed form, which was shaped by the potter's hand soon after the bowl was thrown on the wheel. So this shape, which is called suhama in Japanese, it roughly translates to sandy beach, refers to the undulating curve of the rim, which invokes a sandy shoreline. So this shape became popular among 17th century Japanese tea practitioners. And although the bowl is actually slightly larger than a regular tea bowl, which raises the possibility that it was a serving bowl, the surface ornamentation, form, and notch foot are all characteristics that it shares with extant commission kōrai chawan. And now I'd like to turn to a Japanese example of a tea bowl. So this tea bowl is from the early 17th century, and it demonstrates the intersection between Korean technology and Japanese aesthetics. In the words of Curator Emerita of Ceramics at our museum, Louise Court, this tea bowl is, quote, a powerful little sculpture made to be held in the hands in the guise of a tea bowl. I think that quote sums this object up perfectly. It was a tea bowl made at the Motoyashiki kiln in the former Mino province or present-day Gifu prefecture in the beginning of the 17th century. And its bowls, its shape, glaze, and ornamentation point to what is now called the Black Oribe style. So Oribe is, Furuta Oribe is a warrior tea practitioner who was active from the late 16th into the early 17th century. And the kind of abstracted design, high contrast of colors, combining cream, black, and green are closely associated with his aesthetic. And this bowl in particular features a lustrous black glaze, which bears incised graphic motifs as well as other unrelated abstracted patterns brushed across the white Mino clay. And finally, the bowl was coated in certain areas with translucent Shino glaze. The overlapping black and translucent glazes create very gray tones across the surface of the tea bowl. And according to the archaeologist Inoue Kikuo, the Motoyashiki kilns opened in 1607, and it was in operation until 1615. And its establishment represents a historic shift in both production method and stylistic development of Japanese ceramics. So until the 17th century, Mino wares were fired in small single-chamber kilns in continuation of medieval Japanese ceramic technology. But these kilns really limited the potter's ability to control the firing to create specific outcomes. The main Motoyashiki kiln was built as a chain of 14 chambers climbing up a hillside. And each chamber was linked by vents to allow heat to rise to the next chamber, while allowing for each chamber to be sequentially and independently fired to control the atmosphere and the temperature. So this kiln technology was introduced by the very Korean potters brought to Japan and transmitted to Mino by a potter with experience operating these kilns. So Mino may sound familiar because earlier in my presentation, I mentioned how for a long time, the Seto and Mino kilns had generated a lot of income for the Mino lords who oversaw the operation of these kilns. So I'd like to note that even with these established kilns that have been in operation for centuries in Japan, that influx of technology from Korea really allowed for a new production and style of ceramics in Japan. And this is occurring without any direct contact or input from Korean potters at the Mino kilns. So this new kiln technology led to higher firing temperatures, allowed for the clear definition of painted decoration under translucent glazes. And potters also experimented with the thickness of the vessels, first throwing them on a hand turn as opposed to a kick wheel, which is used in Korea and Western Japan. So you do see the combination of this regional hand turn wheel with the climbing kiln technology coming in from Korea. And this is just a bird's eye view to show how the shape is distorted. And so this distortion of the tea bowl shape, which would have been originally round, allowed for not just interesting silhouette, but also a larger flattened surface on the outside of the tea bowl, which became a canvas for incised and painted decoration. And you can see here that with these two tea bowls side by side, that there's some visual similarities in terms of the distorted shape, the more freehand kind of abstracted incised designs. And it's very crucial that in 2018, in terms of thinking about this relationship between Korea and Japan and this cross-cultural exchange, right now it may seem like it's just a one-way street in terms of Korean ceramics coming into Japan and then the technology coming into Japan as well. But in 2018, archaeologists and art historians Katayama Mabi and Nadongo discovered a Japanese ceramic shirt at a former Wegwan site in Busan. So this irrevocably proved that ceramics were central to cross-cultural exchange between Japan and Korea, that there was a back and forth exchange. And this furthers our understanding of how order-made kōrai chawan were the result of a collaborative and iterative process. Though there is no evidence that this particular Mino tea bowl, for example, was the model for the order-made kōrai chawan to the left, the distorted forms, as I mentioned earlier, the abstraction and the playful designs really reflect the shared aesthetic sensibilities that Japanese collectors appreciated with regards to their tea bowls. So this is just another bird's eye view where you can see that approach to distorting the shape of the bowl. This is another comparison where you can see how there's the Puncheong tea bowl to the left, the Motoyashiki kiln Mino tea bowl to the right, and then in the center is this order-made kōrai chawan and how it synthesizes characteristics and aesthetics of both ceramics that are flanking it. And this is a bird's eye view as well that shows you the kind of progression, not necessarily progression, I guess, but the connection between the Japanese and Korean examples and then the hybrid example in the center. Oh, so apologies for this very poor quality image. I wasn't aware that it was so bad until now, but this is the second case study that I'd like to explore. And I realize that I may be running out of time, so I'm going to try to go through this case study a bit more quickly. But this is an example of a famous order-made kōrai chawan, which was designed by Kobori Enshu, another famous warrior tea practitioner who under the Tokugawa regime was responsible for construction projects, primarily that of gardens. So he had a lot of access to cultural capital resources, and he was heavily invested in tea and the production of tea-related wares in Japan, but also in Korea. So this particular style is called the standing crane tea bowl. Standing crane order-made Korean tea bowl that became closely linked to Kobori Enshu. But you see that in terms of this design of the crane, it really goes back actually to Koryo Dynasty examples of saladons. So you may wonder, this is going back in time quite a bit, like beyond the 16th century into the Koryo Dynasty. And there's evidence in terms of archaeology, for example, that these kinds of high quality celadons were going to Japan, as evidenced by the Shinan shipwreck of 1323. So that underwater excavation unearthed massive quantities of Chinese ceramics that were headed to Japan, but also among them, a very exclusive set of what were essentially antiques at that time, antique Koryo celadons that were headed to Japan. So you can see here on this bowl designs of phoenixes, peonies, but also cranes along the edges there on the inside of the bowl. And then this is an example of a shirt unearthed at a 16th century site in Kyoto. So this is a 12th century Koryo celadon unearthed at a 16th century site in Kyoto. So you see that there's a continued appreciation for these kinds of Koryo celadons, even in 16th century Japan. And it's clear that in terms of this inlaid design of the crane one, it's important that it's inlaid, which is a technique that you see in Koryo Seldons. It's also inlaid in both white and black. So it's a visual reference to that tradition from the Koryo dynasty. And this particular tea bowl becomes a new mode of making ceramics in Japan. So this is an example of the same type of tea bowl, but it's made in Japan. And it's important to note that this was not made as a forgery. This object is actually signed by the artist Ninami Dohachi, which was a potter active in Kyoto. So this is a way for the potters in Japan to show their skill. The fact that they have a repertoire, the fact that they can make different kinds of ceramics is something that they're demonstrating to their patrons and their clients. And among those is this order-made kōrai chawan. So the ability of a Japanese potter relies on their ability to articulate these ceramic styles and techniques that come from Korea. So you can see how Korea is very much a part of this 17th century, but also getting into 18th century, 19th century Japanese visual culture. And this is another example as well from the 18th century by Kiyomizu Rokubei, also a potter active in Kyoto. And you see that there is some variation and some liberties in interpretation in terms of the shape of the bowl, in terms of the clays that they're using, because of course they're not making these in Korea, they're making these in Japan, but still it's a clear reference to kōrai chawan and the aesthetic of kōrai chawan. And then in our museum, we have this example, which is made in Nara Prefecture. And it's also, once again, a copy of that kōrai chawan, but not a forgery, something that is an homage to, a reference to this original that was commissioned by Kobori Inshu. And this example here is quite faithful, I think, to the original in terms of the glaze effects that are caused by the reduction and oxidization atmospheres in the kiln. You also see the throwing marks from the potter's finger or a tool towards the top of the rim, which is something that you see in the original. But there are other examples of ceramics in our museum that show an adaptation of this design. So this is now applied, that standing crane motif is now applied to the surface of this tea caddy, which has a similar kind of pinkish blush glaze, but it's a different format now. It's a tea caddy, and also instead of just one crane, there are three cranes. So it's a trio of cranes, but the inlaid motifs, the fact that it's inlaid, and then the fact that it's executed in black and white is also clear reference to that order-made kōrai chawan. And then you have this tea bowl, which is featuring this trio of cranes once again, but it's been abstracted now. It's executed entirely in white as opposed to white and black. But the black is still there in that it is the main color of the glaze. So you have that contrast between the black and white. And this is something that's adapted from this Japanese tradition of raku ceramics, which is the subject of one of the exhibitions at the museum right now that I curated. But the shape actually of this tea bowl is another reference to kōrai chawan, this particular silhouette of an order-made kōrai chawan categorized as the goki type. So you see a combination of aspects, not just the design of the inlaid cranes, but also the silhouette of the bowl, drawing upon examples of kōrai chawan. And then so you can see here the combination of the silhouette and form of this order-made kōrai chawan, the design of the three cranes on this tea caddy, culminating in this interesting interpretation in black and white of the motifs and the silhouettes that you see to the center and to the left. And then this example here just expands the canvas that the potter is able to work with. So instead of just three cranes, we have 5 here, and then there's actually more on the surface of this water container, which is also used in the context of Japanese tea to store fresh water for boiling. And it's sticking to this contrast between the black glaze and the slip inlaid designs executed in white. So here you can see a progression, a visual progression of beginning with that model of the standing crane order-made kōrai chawan to the tea caddy, which retains the initial palette of the Gohon kōrai chawan, but with more cranes. Then moving on to that black and white contrast on the tea bowl, and then finally example of this expanded kind of expression, exploration of the crane motif on this larger water container. And I'm just going to end my presentation here with this tea bowl once again, because I want to turn to this print here, which is also in the collection of our museum. It's from the Meiji era and by painter and lacquer artist, but also print artist called Shibata Zeshin, which really reflects the enduring aesthetic prominence of kōrai chawan, especially order-made kōrai chawan in Japan. So this depicts a order-made Mishima tea bowl that is strikingly similar to the example that we have in our collection. And you can notice the undulating shape of the rim, the inlaid designs that harken to that Mishima, that Punchang aesthetic. And there's also the placement of a case for a bamboo tea scoop that reminds the viewer of how the appreciation for kōrai chawan is firmly tied to the context of Japanese tea practice. And the tea documents that name and define all the different types of kōrai chawan, including order-made examples, would have been available in Zeshin's time, indicating that the awareness of these imported ceramics from Korea survived centuries after they first came to Japan. So in the context of this artist, Zeshin's oeuvre, it seems that the print was intended as a representation of period Japanese visual culture and not as an archaic or exotic image of an unusual foreign item. And so the popularity and renown of kōrai chawan continues into the present, where tea practitioners continue to use and appreciate these tea bowls. And this Saturday at our museum, we're having our inaugural public tea demonstration featuring a gift from Greg Kinsey, the Kinsey Chanoyu collection, which amounts to more than 170 tea utensils that Greg himself collected for his own practice as a tea practitioner. And one of the tea bowls that will be used is actually a Japanese copy related to the national treasure that I showed earlier. So this is really a living aesthetic, a living practice that shows that deep connection between Korea and Japan through ceramics. So I'll end my talk there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Let's give another big round of applause to Dr. Jung. Thank you so much for giving this wonderful talk on the transcultural history of kōrai chawan in Japan, early modern Japan. So now we will have about 30 minutes of question and answer time. So if you have questions, there are two ways to ask those questions to Dr. Jung. First, you can use the raise hand function of the Zoom meeting to let me know that you want to ask question. Once I see those raise hand icon next to your name, I will call you out and ask you to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and raise question. Another way is to use the chat box if you're unable to deliver your question directly. So in the chat box, you can type down the question. I will organize them in the order I received and have Dr. Jung to answer those questions in those order. I will first read out loud those questions to everyone, and then we will hear from Dr. Jung. And you can either make those questions available, seen by everyone in the Zoom meeting, or you can just send those questions privately to me so that I can announce those questions anonymously. So if you have questions, please let us know. So let me indulge with my ignorant question first. So I remember when I was reading your article, you mentioned that there is very little, almost virtually no kind of reference on the practice of kōrai chawan in Korean sources, Korean textual sources. And I'm just wondering, have you thought about what are the kind of the reasons why this practice has never been mentioned in Korean sources?
So in terms of kōrai chawan, of course, this is a term that was coined in Japan. So that's important to remember that this is a Japanese term and this is a Japanese concept that emerges in the 16th century. So that's what I was referring to, but also, so in historic documents that are Korean, for example, you wouldn't see this term. And then in terms of Korean scholarship, because these ceramics don't really survive in Korea because, of course, they went to Japan. They were used in Japan, but also it's important to remember that the earliest kōrai chawan were not made to be used as tea bowls in Japan. So a larger quantity and variety of Korean ceramics were brought to Japan, and then from what was available, tea practitioners decided, okay, this is going to be suitable for tea. And you see that even with the tea diaries themselves, there are about 612 mentions of the term kōrai chawan or terms related to kōrai chawan in the 16th century. They will use terms like large kōrai chawan, small kōrai chawan. Some tea practitioners will even write about tea bowls that they saw and say things like, I don't think this is very good. So it's really something that's being defined as time goes on. So each time a tea practitioner is using a tea bowl, that's another opportunity for them to really assess, is this something that I like? Is this something that I want to continue using? And also they're responding to how their guests are evaluating, responding to the objects that they're selecting. So I think it's important to remember that in terms of kōrai chawan as a category, like in Japan, it really changes over time, even into the 20th century. And even in the 20th century, auction records show that people are still weeding out and deciding what is worthy of being a kōrai chawan and what is not. And so in terms of the kind of research that's unfolded on kōrai chawan, as a result, it's very much limited to Japanese studies, Japanese art history, and as I mentioned, the even narrower field of Japanese tea studies. So there are scholars who are a part of this context of tea practice in the present day, because you may be aware of this, in Japan, there are 3 major schools of tea. And those 3 major schools were founded by the descendants of a tea master who was also a merchant in Japan called Sen no Rikyu or Sen Soeki. So he was the tea master to Hideyoshi. For unknown reasons, he was ordered to commit suicide by Hideyoshi, and his descendants, when they were able to kind of show their face in public again, establish these tea schools, and they claim that they're the heirs, that they're the true representatives of Rikyu's taste and Rikyu's method of practicing tea. And so you have this kind of political situation in contemporary Japan surrounding the study and appreciation of tea objects and tea history. So kōrai chawan has really been limited in that field. But I mentioned in my presentation Katayama Mabi, who is a professor at Tokyo University of the Arts. I had the privilege of studying with her when I was in Japan. And she's really one of the pioneering scholars who's bridging that gap between Korea and Japan as an art historian, but also as an archaeologist. So by looking at archaeological data in Korea, but also in Japan, she's showing the kind of connections that exist there between Korea and Japan in terms of ceramic trade, technical exchange, aesthetic exchange. And so she's really begun to kind of open up discourse in terms of our awareness of how permeable that kind of wall has been between Korea and Japan in terms of ceramics. But still with kōrai chawan, there tends to be this treatment of these objects, even though they're definitely Korean. There's no doubt about the fact that these are Korean ceramics. It's considered as something that's a part of Japanese art history. And you really see that too with the designation of that one tea bowl as a national treasure. So thank you for your question. And I'm happy to answer more.
Well, I think that's more than enough. Thank you so much. So we have another question from Ji-hyun Moon. So I'll ask Ji-hyun Moon to unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask question to Dr. Jung.
Hi, my name is Jia Moon, and I'm from student in Yonsei University. And my question is about, so you introduced that there were people who were moved to Japan from Korea who were had either like a dexterous woman or other skillful people to maybe create more kōrai. So I was just curious about either was there like a development of kōrai related to those people who could create more pottery, I guess? Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I addressed this very briefly in my presentation, but I'm happy to talk more about this. So it's important to note that in terms of the potters who were brought from Korea to Japan, they weren't brought because Japan wanted to locally produce kōrai chawan. So the examples that I showed towards the end that are essentially copies of the order-made kōrai chawan, those were made by Japanese potters. So these are potters who are not descended from Korean potters, but who are Japanese potters based in Kyoto. So not the potters that are based in Kyushu, where most of the kilns were operated and run by Korean potters and their descendants. And but what is interesting is that at those kilns that were established in Japan, yes, they actually do make tea ceramics, and some of those ceramics happen to be tea bowls. But within Japan, and within the sphere of Japanese tea culture, no one sees those tea bowls actually as kōrai chawan. They see those tea bowls as being Japanese ceramics. So that's an important distinction, that even though you have Korean potters living and working and creating ceramics in Japan in the 17th century, the Japanese patrons and collectors are simultaneously looking for and sending orders for Korean ceramics made in Korea to be brought to Japan. So I think this is proof that in Japan, there's a continued appreciation for things Korean. They're aware that Korean potters are in Japan, but there's value to the fact that they're able to get ceramics that are made in Korea, and they recognize these products as being Korean. And this is something that is in contrast with the general understanding and appreciation of paintings, for example, at the same time. So there's a lot of confusion in historic records in Japan when it comes to paintings that are coming from abroad. So there have been instances, for example, where Korean paintings are being categorized as Chinese paintings. So despite the fact that with paintings, there isn't that distinction and appreciation for something being Korean, when it comes to ceramics, there is an appreciation and awareness in Japan that things are Korean. And there's actually even an interesting case study where there was a Chinese ceramic that was for a very long time marketed and appreciated something that is Korean. So it was categorized as a kōrai chawan for a long time. After archaeological analysis and study, now it's clear that it's an example of a ceramic that was made in southern China. So it's not Korean at all. But you don't really see that kind of mislabeling for paintings, where someone thinks that something is Korean, but it actually turns out to be Chinese. If anything, the tendency is to say that something is Chinese rather than Korean. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
So I have another question from the audience. So I received it directly. So let me read out loud this question. So my question for Dr. Jung is, how have these historical cross-cultural interactions impact the practice of contemporary artists, ceramists? That's one question. And second question is, do you have any information about specific contemporary artists who utilize techniques paralleling early kōrai chawan ceramics?
Thank you for that question. That's something that I'm interested in as well. And yes, they're actually both Japanese and Korean potters who make ceramics that are based on and inspired by the heirloom kōrai chawan that exists today. And so it's an interesting question, right? Because you have Japanese potters that are making something that is supposedly Korean, but they're using Japanese materials, and then you have Korean potters who are making something that is Korean, but they're saying that it's specifically kōrai chawan. So you see that kind of dialogue that's still occurring, a cross-cultural dialogue that's occurring in the context of contemporary Japanese and Korean ceramics. So I think it's a really exciting kind of moment to really think about the value of these kinds of hybrid ceramics, the fact that you have these ceramics that have this shared cultural appeal. Sorry, I hope that answered the question.
Thank you very much for the answer, Dr. Jung. So the next question that I have is from Sam Bermish. Let me read out loud this question. So the Kizaemon place doesn't look like anything you would find in any Korean museum. Are there any similar places from Korea, Korean archaeology? How certain is its 16th century dating?
Thank you for your question, and also thank you for coming to my talk, because Professor Verbish was one of the people who basically selected my application to be funded through Kyujanggak. So I appreciate your support and also your presence here today at my talk, which stemmed from that research period. So in terms of the Kizaemon piece, that T-bowl, yes, it doesn't really look like anything you would find in the Korean museum. And that's also precisely why a lot of these kōrai chawan tend to be overlooked within the context of Korean art history. It doesn't really fit neatly into the way we understand Korean ceramic history in terms of the dynastic styles, the Koryo Saladons moving on to the early Chosŏn Puncheongware, followed by that moment of fracture in the Imjin War that precipitates into the kind of white porcelain production in the late Chosŏn Dynasty. Like the kōrai chawan don't really fit neatly into that, but archaeological evidence at kiln sites in Korea show examples of ceramics that are similar to the Kizaemon T-bowl. So that T-bowl is a type of ceramic that's categorized as soft paste porcelain. So essentially a type of porcelain that's a bit more porous because it wasn't fired at temperature that were as high as some of the finer, harder, more vitrified porcelains. And it's a tricky issue too when it comes to archaeology and heirloom objects. So with these heirloom objects, they've been used over generations, centuries by tea practitioners. So they're actually preparing and drinking tea out of them. And in the case of Kizaemon, it is a national treasure, but it's at a Buddhist temple in Japan. It's at the Kohoan sub-temple. It's part of the Daitokuji Zen temple. And they still use this tea bowl. They still prepare and drink tea out of it, which means that with the more porous body of this tea bowl, it's definitely taken on the kind of patina of use over time. So you have that tea bowl, that heirloom tea bowl, which bears the physical marks of its use over time. It's probably changed in appearance. And then you look at something that's been excavated that has just been underground with no exposure to tea, it's going to look different. And so there hasn't been an exact match between a bowl like the Kyujanggak and something found at an archaeological site in Korea. And actually, there are similar bowls that have been excavated, or shards of bowls that have been excavated in Japan, but they don't look exactly like the Kyujanggak. So it's a bit tricky, but when it comes to just the basic characteristics of the ceramic, not getting into the specifics of exactly what color is the glaze, you do notice that there's similar 16th century Korean examples. So that's how scholars, archaeologists have been able to date the Kyujanggak to the 16th century.
So next question is from Haley Chang. So Haley Chang, please unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and tell us your question, please.
Hello, Dr. Jung. Dr. Jung, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I'm an associate curator of Asian art at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College. I would like to know more about the national identity of these Korea chawans in the curatorial setting. We've been talking a lot about the cultural identity of this object, and naturally, as a curator, I am thinking about how would this object would be contextualized in the gallery settings that is in many of the museums in the US divided by the national boundaries. There might be a possible potential of benefits and the loss of exhibiting these work in the Japanese art gallery or the Korean art gallery, because these were in this very mercurial liminal space of cultural boundaries. As a curator at the National Museum of Asian Art, how you envision using these objects that's transcending the national boundaries in your museum?
Thank you for your question, and great to meet you in this virtual setting. Thank you for coming to my talk as well. I think it's a very important question, and I think this kind of gets into actually our institutional history. For a long time at our museum, we had a curator for ceramics, Louise Kor, whose research was primarily about Japanese ceramics. She wrote a very important book on the Shigaraki kilns in Japan, which is one of the oldest operating kilns, continuously operating kilns in Japan. But she also did research on South Asian ceramics, focusing on Thailand, Vietnam. She also looked at our Near Eastern ceramics collection, Chinese ceramics, and also Korean ceramics. It was really under her leadership that, in conjunction with the National Museum of Korea, but also other scholars from Korea and Japan, that our museum catalog our extensive collection of Korean ceramics. That's really the area of our strength right now as a museum in terms of Korean art. It's the ceramics, the Koryo celadons, and also Chosŏn, Buncheong, and porcelain as well. But there are also a lot of these tea ceramics, these tea bowls, which at the time Freer was collecting were widely available in Japan. He was influenced by collectors, industrialists, art collectors in Japan at the time, who were heavily engaged in tea themselves. And so even though Freer himself didn't practice tea, he collected a lot of tea-related ceramics, which is why we have examples of these kōrai chawan. So in terms of the way that these ceramics tend to have been exhibited, we do have galleries that focus on different areas. And of course, Japan, Korea, and China are prominent galleries. I haven't really shown any Korean ceramics in the Japan galleries because right now we don't have a dedicated curator for Korean art, but we will be hiring our inaugural Curator of Korean Art and Culture very soon at our museum, which is a great moment to mark the centennial of our museum, which was last year, 2023. And so I'm really looking forward to working closely with my new colleague and thinking about ways we can demonstrate the cross-cultural impact of Korean art, particularly Korean ceramics, in our galleries. We do have a space that's dedicated to showing these kinds of cross-cultural relationships and connections that will be opening from 2025. So I'm hoping to kind of test drive that representation and kind of discussion around the cross-cultural currents that are present within Japanese tea collections, because it's not just Korea, it's China, it's also Southeast Asia and South Asia as well, in terms of the textiles that became popular among Japanese tea practitioners. So I think that the way forward in terms of these discussions is to really show how cosmopolitan and how globally connected these communities were. So we may feel like, oh, you know, because they didn't have internet back then, because there wasn't social media, there wasn't this transfer of knowledge and this circulation of aesthetics and culture, but it happened within the elite sphere, certainly. And that's something that we can make an effort to show at our museums, but it definitely requires a collaboration, and it requires an eye, I think, towards those historic connections that are not necessarily visible when we approach art and art history and just history and culture in general from a modern understanding of nation states and nationalism. So I hope that answers your question, and I hope that we can continue these discussions as well in the future. Thank you.
Lee, thank you so much.
I think we can have one or two more questions before we end the Q&A session. So if you have any questions reserved in your mind, this is time to open up.
I think I saw a question in the chat, and it's a pretty quick question to answer. Dr. Chan, it's great to see you. It's been a while. Thank you for your question. So it's about the print that I showed at the end by Shibata Zeshin. And the question is, do you know when the marvelous and evocative Zeshin print came into the collection? So that's something that came in 2003 with the Robert O. Muller collection. So there are other prints by Zeshin, mostly of like kind of vignettes of daily life and also of some still life objects. But I think this print really stood out to me because it's the only print that depicts a tea object.
Thank you, Dr. Jung, for pointing out the question that I missed from the chat box. So I apologize, Dr. Chance, for missing your question. Just to kind of remind the readers what the question was. The question was about, do you know when the marvelous and evocative Zeshin print came into collection? As Dr. Jung has provided her answer. So thank you for delivering those questions in the chat box again.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Chan. If we don't have any other questions, previously we had other CHS team member, Dr. Sexiang Wang, but he left in advance. So I'd like to thank Dr. Jung for, again, presenting your fascinating research and answering to the question from the audience. And I would like to also thank all the participants in today's Zoom meeting, sharing their valuable insight and feedback through those questions and comments. And thanks to the generosity of previous participants, Many of the talks that Chosŏn History Society organized are now available on our YouTube webpage, which is available on our chat box. So please take a moment to visit our YouTube channel to see our previous talks that are recorded and available on our YouTube channel. We also have a Facebook page and Instagram. So if you are on those social media, please follow us. And last but not least, I would also like to share the link of Dr. Jung's article on this particular subject of kōrai chawan and how she utilized the digital humanities tool for mapping the distribution of these kōrai chawan through the analysis of the tea diaries. So please, hope you take a look in those materials. And again, thank you for your time and efforts being here and throughout the talk. We appreciate your presence and input that help us to have an interactive and dynamic conversation in Chosŏn History Society. And we hope to see you again in our next talk, which will be a week after today by Dr. Gabo Sebo about North Korean films. So please stay tuned for our upcoming event, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next talk. So I'd like to send my thanks to Dr. Jung again for this event. And when the recording is over, the Zoom will remain open for another 10 or 15 minutes for those who like to connect with Dr. Jung and to have further informal discussions. So thanks again, and I will end the recording.